My name is Amy Lighthy. Welcome to the third day of the Design Science Symposium here at Rhode Island School of Design. This event is co-sponsored by the Nature Lab here at RISD and also the Synergetics Collaborative. I'm just going to start by giving you a little bit of an overview of the day, and then I'm going to introduce a surprise person to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Today we are going to hear from a master ceramicist. We're going to hear from a design scientist and artist. We're going to hear from we're going to hear about the Student Design Challenge through Biomimicry 3.8. We'll hear about the Solar Decathlon Design Challenge, which is something that the RISD and Brown teams are putting together, and it's quite impressive. It's being built right now. So without further ado, here is my surprise. It's Stephen Lemke. Please welcome senior apprentice Stephen Lemke.
Thank you, Amy. All right, thank you, Amy. Good morning. Thank you for coming this morning. My name is Stephen Lemke. I'm the senior apprentice at the St. John's Pottery. So our keynote lecturer this morning, Richard Bresnahan, he is our artist in residence at St. John's University. St. John's is a small liberal arts college in central Minnesota. They are known for their largest collection of Bauhaus architecture buildings designed by Marcel Breuer on the planet. It's a very unique place that has about 2,800 acres of wooded land. And it's a place where Richard Bresnahan was a student. I was once a student there as well. Richard Bresnahan, he is a master potter. After his time at St. John's, he spent 3.5 years studying with the Nakazato family of National Living Treasure potters in Karatsu, Japan. And that was at a unique time when some of those traditions were sort of waning, right, in their ability for someone to learn from that. And so Richard was sort of welcomed into that family. By the end of his time there, he was given the title of Master Potter by his teacher, and he was the first sort of outsider to come into that family and get that accolade. And then he started what is now called the St. John's Pottery. And if I can pull up that webpage. Perfect, thank you very much. This is our website. Richard started this program in a building called Joe Hall, and it used to be just kind of a mixed-use space and a garage. In the 90s, that building was the program was growing out of what the building could do, and so they moved the building. They put it on 18 pairs of 747 airplane wheels, moved it across campus, built a new foundation specifically for this building that was on the National Register of Historic Places, and made a space specifically for it to be the new St. John's Pottery. So Richard Bresnahan's program, we operate a visiting artist program, Richard's artist in residence program, and an apprenticeship program. So I've been studying with Richard for about 5 years. If there are any RISD students in the audience, I'd be happy to talk to you because that's a very unique experience. Richard's work revolves around creating wood-fired pottery, and so he'll talk about that. And his work is featured in many collections, including the Idemitsu Museum in Tokyo, Japan, the Mary Burke Collection in New York, and the Minneapolis Institute of Arts in Minnesota. So I'll pull this website up. Like I said, I've been studying with Richard for 5 years. Every day I've learned something new, so it's a pretty fantastic experience for me. So it is my great honor to introduce Master Potter Richard Bresnahan.
Thank you. Good morning. I want to thank the RISD hospitality to be able to come this morning, to be able to visit with you just a bit, and then to all the people from STEM to STEAM for the opportunity to bring a creative process into the audience for this morning's lecture. Hopefully this is working now. There we go, thank you. This is the landscape for the St. John's Abbey and University. It's surrounded by 2,800 acres of an ecosystem. There are 9 endangered plant life species, 3 avian species, and 2 mammalian species on the endangered list that are in this particular environment. This is at the edge of the northeastern seaboard's great wooded lands that go all the way from here in Providence, all the way through Wisconsin into Minnesota, ends here, and the prairies begin. This is where the Ice Age stopped 12,000 years ago and melted back, and leaving these beautiful lake environments. As a ceramic artist, one of the things to understand about the ceramic world was the wonderful experience 6,500 years ago when women potters in Chiang Mai, Thailand, took the silicate world above 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. And in that experience, they were able to preserve food without rotting. They could feed their children without starvation, store food underground, and have what Buckminster Fuller called population-based stabilization, the most important thing. So if you remember looking at the Dymaxion map and Fuller talking about the wonders of the human thought process and the human mind, he says where there's population-based stabilization, the human mind has a chance to think and to create and to design. So this is actually eco-architecture. This is 12th century Anagama kilns that were dug into the side of sides of clay banks of hills, and every one of these particular type of kilns was designed for the piece of ceramics that was made. So they were nurturing the flame around the piece. So they weren't just going off and buying a kiln or taking a kiln from a different design. They were looking at the indigenous system, how the system had to take that energy around the system for vitrification to the silicate world, and then become a functional system. So that every day then this process could be handed down generation after generation within each indigenous system that they would move and develop to. So going from an academic institution into an environment of an indigenous family system that makes ceramics. This is the Sarayama families. There's 14 families on a crevice of a mountain in Kyushu, Japan. And you realize then it's not just a singular artist event, it's a familial event, it's a community event. And that mother and father are glazing, they're using the natural ash glazes, and that individuals, even though they may be elderly, feel very much a part of that lived system. So the grandmother is glazing the inside of spice jars. Here they're drying their clay that comes down from the mountainside. This gentleman was 98 years old when I met him in 1976. And he was still felt that he was a vital part, even though he couldn't throw those pots anymore. The sculpture of the ceremonial dragon was very important for the family to store certain kinds of foods, and for that was a warizancho jar for seed spices. The most startling thing for me was to watch women carrying the wood down on their backs out of the mountainsides. Here they have these bamboo baskets, these cargo containers, and they're carrying the wood down on their backs. Those women very quickly figure out that one family's energy is going to become the next family's energy. The next family's energy, the next family's energy. So these energy systems were transferred. So that it was whole families sharing a kiln so that they could then use that energy the most efficiently. They're not going to walk up that mountain again to get another piece of wood if they know that their neighbor and their families can help to assist in that energy transfer. The Nagasato family that I had studied with through an apprenticeship through my art history teacher, Sister Johanna Becker, who is writing a book on the Nagasato family and the ancient Karatsu tradition through Kodansha, was able to give me an apprenticeship. They came here from 1563 in slavery. A mother and a son were brought over under terrible circumstances from Korea into Japan by daimyo warlords to start pottery programs. Whole villages of communities of Korean potters are brought over in bondage to start the high silicate systems in Japan, especially on the Kyushu archipelago. And so the reason why she studied with this family is they had 13 generations of diaries, what it was like to be an artist working with an indigenous system in clay. And so you can see that the aesthetics of the environment are very important. Here a stone boat with a little flotilla of carp fish escorting it across the pond, and then the pots are carried down. Here's the National Living Treasure of Nagasato, Torimon the 12th, at the age of 82, helping his son, who was 65 at the time, unload their most recent firing of work. Families working together in those kinds of firing experience. Karatsu Ceramics is known for its very simple, everyday pieces, elevating the simple storage jar into an art form, and then the simple ironstone painting on feldspathic and wood ash stoneware glazes. The indigenous system of using natural materials was extremely important to that family because that's the cultural identity. You look at a piece of ceramics, you can go into a museum. I was up in your museum. I say, oh, that's from that country. That's from that country. We have forgotten the artists. No one remembers the potters when they're dead. They only remember where it came from, where its sense of place was. So in that sense of place, you can look at a piece of ceramics, no, that's a Karatza ceramics with a Nuka glaze by the nature of its design. The family is also important by the nature of taking care of the master potter, as well as the family sitting around in the studio having a variety of delightful foods together. So as an apprentice, I was supposed to be able to produce pots every day. I was the chief thrower, which was an odd experience for a foreigner. Normally you wouldn't get a chance to do this. But my responsibility was to make 200 to 300 pieces a day. And so after you get through the sequencing of pieces upon pieces upon pieces that you're doing, he then came to me one day and said, I'd like you to make these, and make 1,000 of them, please. So I pulled this out for Joe Clinton. We just had to for Joe, because this is a sphere. So here my teacher throws, it's a beautiful sphere, and then he takes the hair tool and folds it into a triangle. Then he takes a bamboo knife and cuts the triangle out. Then he pulls his fingers back and folds it back, and he lifts it up and holds it up to you. And then if you can see down in the base area, it's a carved foot. So it's a triangular carved foot to hold the piece up. So it's an elegant piece. And I look at it and I make one of these and I say, what the hell am I making? You know, I mean, if in America, you know, a soup bowl is a soup bowl. You pour the soup in and you get on with life. You know, I mean, how are you going to get soup not falling off the sides? You know, so I finally take this piece over and I say, what am I making? In the best Japanese I can, and as politely as I can. Well, my teacher gets up and walks out the door and leaves. So, oh God, here we go again, you know. Half an hour later, he comes back, and he's holding a little branch. And I'm not looking very clearly. So he says, you're making this. And he says, what this is, so when I looked, I saw there were 3 shells of a seed pod that had opened up. And he says, this is the seed pod of the Warizancho seed. This is the 7 sacred spices that were brought by Buddhist monks from China to Japan for healing. And this is the shell that held that next generation seed. That's what you're making. So then I realized that this was a very, very different education that I had had. So this is, then on the day I came to Karatsu, the great artist Koyama Fujio, who's director of the Tokyo National Museum, Idemitsu Museum, who started the National Living Treasure program in Japan, passed away. So I was asked to come and fire his last works. Kenzo Tange, the Bauhaus student, the great architect of Japan, built Koyama Fujio's studio and home, wonderful spaces. And we then fired the last of his work in a Teppo Gama, Tanegashima style. And so my first experience was in that firing, you're stoking wood right in amongst the pottery. I'm going, God, I'm having this first experience. I'm thinking of nice, shiny glazeware and all these types of things coming out. And then after 10 days of firing, we open it up, and the whole thing is filled with ashes, and it looks like a disaster inside the kiln. And I'm going, what are these people so excited about? So then we start on taking these pieces out, and then we washing the ashes off, and then a whole world of color palette opens up, of design that most of my friends when I was in college, and the graduate students and the artists that taught us from the 1950s, well, we were all looking for how we could work with earth to have its earthen colors come forward without having the manipulation, because we'd be spraying cobalts and various heavy metals on the clay surfaces to try and get our materiality. And here this was happening naturally, an organic movement of flame and color, atmosphere, changing the surfaces. And then I realized I'd been tricked. That all my education had been abstract. And that I had no way of connecting the beautiful persimmon flower to the 6 persimmons, the most important Zen painting of Zen Buddhism at Daitokuji. That somehow the spirituality of the 6 persimmons had been lost by the connection to the flower. So, well, how am I going to do this? How am I going to take the metaphysical to to the physical, the Adorti table of everyday life into the table of the spiritual world. How was I going to make those connections to the communities in my family? So I returned back to North Dakota, to where I was born. Probably have heard it in the news. I was born in Castleton, North Dakota, where 6 rail cars just exploded with oil. 3/4 of a mile outside of my hometown where I used to fish, the reservoir is now polluted with oil. So the water's all contaminated, the soil's gone. Frank Wool, our family farm next to that, has now been contaminated. So I went out to these areas to look and say, is there something that I have missed? Is there something that I don't know about my own homeland that I need to discover to become a real person? So I had very close friends within the Native American community, but they don't want to talk to us anymore. There's no way that the Christian cross is ever going to get to the Sacred Buffalo. That's over with. Why do we continue to do this? Well, I had to go back and look. This is a photograph after World War II. This is the Secretary of the Interior, Washington, D.C., signing away 490,000 acres of sacred burial grounds of all these Native Americans. So everybody who's not looking, because the Native American tradition is if you don't look at what the disasters are, it's not happening. So here all these men have their eyes closed, they're not looking at the signature, except for the one man who's weeping. So I decide that I have to go further back, that I have to understand a little bit more. I used to have a photograph of Newt Gingrich up here on a Halloween costume, but that was a little too close to the vest because we don't really think about our politicians as buffoons, but they really are. And so this is Augustus the Great of Poland. So our guest from Poland, I'm sorry, but Augustus the Strong, 1653, he said, if we have lots of porcelain around you, we're not going to die. Because porcelain had just started coming in 1646 to the other side of the planet from China and then from Japan to the Koimari. Beautiful, high-temperature silicate systems, multiple glazed, 7 times in a kiln, out of kiln to give these wonderful results. So they start eating off these things and everyone starts feeling better. Because if you remember what prior to porcelainic materials coming to the European continent, people were eating off of lead-glazed earthenware out of a desert culture, out of Lebanon, Syria, into Turkey, into the Greco-Roman Empire. Lead-glazed earthenware was the normal food service system prior to porcelainic materials showing up in the 1650s. So everyone knows what happens with earthenware when it absorbs water, can't evaporate. It's perfect for a desert culture, but in a European culture, not such a hot idea because you're still growing bacteria. So the World Health Association had studies that were that 48% of the mortality in children from birth to age 5 was higher than in the Pacific Rim in China and the Chinese records. Because they were, Louis Pasteur's 150 years later, they were infecting themselves with dysentery and abdominal diseases because the earthenware doesn't dry out. Okay? So then Augustus the Great calls in his architects. We have a room full of architects and designers. And now the corporate society would like us to come in and design what they want, not what you want. So Augustus the Great did the same thing. Architects come in and make me porcelain rooms. So they bankrupt their countries and bringing porcelain in. They're building these beautiful decorative systems to hold the porcelain, more designs, hours and hours of designs, designing decoration onto the surface for these wonderful porcelains. The Republican Party has always been late. They've never been on time. So what did that do to the other side of the planet? What was the effect of that type of misunderstanding? Because 150 years later, Louis Pasteur discovers bacteria. Those are some of the issues that we now know. We know domestic engineering. We know that if we use soap, we can kill bacteria on the surface. We know about food and dispensation of food, supposedly. This is the first National Geographic explorers that got to Chindochen in 1914. It was interrupted by World War I. And so this wasn't published till November, the November issue of the National Geographic in 1918. This is the Chindochen Porcelain Center. So here you're seeing the various kiln sites and the individuals making the pots. The gentleman here on the left-hand side, he was paid the most because he blew the glazes on. So they died at the age of 32 with their lungs filling up with silicosis. So they got paid the most out of all the various crafts and things. The appropriate technology industry says if you make something and you don't use it in your daily life experience, then you either abuse your workers, you abuse the material, or you abuse your environment. So all of these teapots that you see that are lined up, the Chinese were never drinking tea like that. They were shipping those teapots over to Europe and had no understanding of why they were doing that at that time period. They were drinking the tea leaves out of bowl because tea was an apothecary medicinal system. It wasn't an advertising system to make money. It was a form of healing. What I'd like you to look very closely, if you have time, is up at the hillside right here. When the explorer from the National Geographic comes, he's coming up the river and he notices there isn't a tree within 150 square miles. The soil has been turned into a desert. The poor potter can't grow their own food. Wait for the German Industrial Revolution to come to China and relieve the poor potter of his suffering. 100 years forward, look what we have. So what you're seeing in the back of the mound up here, down and below you see the porcelain clay is being, they lost all their clay deposits. They'd used everything up. So the clay had to come downriver at great expense. All the wood had to be brought downriver at great expense. They had basically destroyed their ecosystem. But that pile of mountain that you see right here were all broken shards. If it didn't meet the European standard for being exactly alike, they would break it up, smash it up after all the firings, and throw it into a pile. And this pile went for 150 yards and was 90 feet tall. In a kiln, out a kiln, in a kiln, out a kiln 7 times, like putting 5 more gas tanks on a Hummer. And then throwing it away into the silicate system. At the bottom of those piles was guanware. The bottom of those shard piles, very few of these is guanware. 1 energy unit, the pot was made on the wheel, it was dipped in a glaze, it was fired 1 energy unit to melt the surface of the glaze. They were so loved that everyday use provided this crackle pattern. So that was that single energy unit system. And then I would take my students to Kohler Corporation. We walk into our lavatories and our homes. We have all these beautiful sinks and toilets and urinals and industrial ceramics. We were touring and they were showing us this beautiful sink, $900 sink. And they were explaining how wonderful this is that it can go in a kiln and out a kiln 3 times. We've got a Pentium chip, a computerized Pentium chip doing a random crackle pattern on the inside of this to emulate a 1 energy unit system. So 3 energy units to make 1 energy unit system to emulate from the 15th century. Have we progressed? So before touching anything, when I came back to St. John's, I'm not going to buy anything. I'm not going to do this anymore. I will only use out of the waste stream system and only what is available to me from my own indigenous and only work with natural materials. So we found a clay deposit that was in a road cut. All the finest clays in Minnesota, as well as in the Midwest, as well as in America, end up getting mixed into Class 5 gravel and Class 2 shouldering gravel for road construction. They don't care what type of quality of clay it is, just as long as it's close to the gravel pile. So when they mix it, they're paying the least amount of money. There's no educational link to understanding that this deposit's 144 million years old, and that students over here in the RISD Center, when they want to buy Grolic, are going to pay $1 a pound for something like this. All right? So I went to the president of the university at that time and said, we found this beautiful clay deposit. Next year, Collegeville Township is going to dig that clay deposit out of the road because the contractor screwed the township by not digging the clay deposit out of the road, so that cars and trucks were sliding off in the spring and the fall during the frost heaves. So they were going to get rid of this deposit and contaminate it. So I went to Father Michael Blecker. No, I first went to the bank. You know, that was a really bad idea. I went to the Avon. I had hair at the time, and I had a little checking account at the Avon State Bank, and I went to Art Dietrich, the president of the bank. I said, Art, I want to get a $4,000 loan. Here's my old van as collateral. He said, what do you want to do with this loan? I said, well, I want to dig 300 years of clay deposit to bring over to St. John's for pottery studio. He says, get the hell out of my bank. So, okay, Art. So then I went to the president of the university, Father Michael Blecker. I said, Father Michael, I found this wonderful clay deposit. We've tested it out. It's a beautiful stonework clay. I'd like to dig enough clay for 300 years of pottery making in St. John's. First, to be generational. Second, to be with the deepest respect to all those natural materials. And I can't use the word sustainability anymore because when it comes out of a politician's mouth, it's like collateral damage. They've ruined the word. So now I only talk about eco-mutualism because the politicians can't spell that yet. So we then, for 3.5 days, so Father Michael turns in his chair and he looks at me and he says, well, Richard, 300 years in comparison to 1,500 years of Benedictine history is not all that long. I trust what you're doing. Okay, there's the difference between that academic institution and my other colleagues and friends that are institutions where that someone's going to say, how long, Peter, is tenure going to last for you? You know, you're not going to get 300 years of wood stacked up here behind RISD with the idea that all those trees that lost in a storm are going to go. They're going to think you're crazy. They're just thinking how long your tenure is going to last. So that's the whole idea, is that to bring those long-term concepts of generational learning, because long after I'm gone, someone's going to have the same material to work with, the same cultural regionalism to express from in that experience. So that's the clay. And then to work with glazed materials, because we are part of our history, because of that history of porcelainic materials, understanding that if it was glazed and shiny, it was safe. That's that whole kind of industrial concept history that we were brought from the 18th century. And I'm not living in the 18th century anymore. And so we go out to our family farms in North Dakota, and now we do this in Minnesota and a variety of places. This is a navy bean straw stack. So when I went to my relatives, I said, Uncle Leo, I'd like to burn a straw stack for the ashes to make glazes. Well, this is what they use for their bedding animals. So they're going, oh God, we got to deal with this crazy black sheep in the family again. But sure, I'll trust you. But then you bring back a bowl like that out of navy bean straw ash glaze with the carving of the farm field, the plowed fields, and you give this down to Hildegard, life changes. They now see their world differently. Those straw ashes are very different in their mind now because they're serving food out of those bowls. So then this is burning flax straw ash out in the prairies, and this is what the flax straw ash looks like as a natural glaze. So again, Stephen had mentioned it earlier that the idea was also not to, because the monks made these bricks. When they got out in 1857, they made 15,000 bricks a day out of earthenware material. So we're not going to tear down those buildings and put them in a landfill. We need to preserve those, because you've got to go up to that cemetery sometime and you're going to have to tell them that you didn't throw their stuff away. So this is the 747 wheel assemblies lifting up a 780-ton building, moving it about 30 to 40 feet a day to build the new studio. This is the Johanna kiln. It's an 87-foot wood-burning kiln, 6 feet wide, 7 feet tall. It takes 12,000 pieces to fire the kiln. It takes 7 to 8 weeks of loading. 10 days of firing, 14 days of cooling, 7 days to 10 days of unloading, and 9 months of cleaning. It does not fit into an academic system. No kid's going to wait a year and a half for a grade. Or the parents who are paying the bill. But it's the best ecological model because it's 4 times more energy efficient than my industrial car gas kiln with computerized firing system with 98% energy efficient Venturi burners. The other aspect I'd like to have you look at very closely is these brown areas right here that we're loading. And you can see that pieces are stacked, one on top of each other. Some of you have received gifts from the kiln, from the 12th firing, and those cups were in amongst wild rice hulls. This is a wild rice hull material. When I first came to St. John's, Brother Julius brought down 2 elders from the Red Lake Indian Reservation, from the First Nation. We have a lot of reservations in Minnesota. And I went to high school with 3 students from the Red Lake Indian Reservation when I was in high school. And so their uncle, Duck Soup, Oren Bolio's uncle, Duck Soup, and Wayne, Marv Hansen's uncle, had come down with Brother Julius and were sitting by the wood kiln firing. And when you're young and in college, you complain a lot. You know, it's just a normal kind of young person's whining. And I did the same thing. So I'm sitting with these 2 elders from the Red Lake Indian Reservation, and I'm talking about how I'm wadding all my pots to keep from sticking onto the shelves. And on Tanagashima Island, we use some rice hulls and for separation, for close packing systems. And so I was kind of talking about this type of system. And they were going to church that day, and so I was holding the car door open for one of the elders from the Red Lake Indian Reservation as he got into his car. And he held on to the car door and he looked up to me and he said, "What about wild rice hulls? My nation gifts this to you. My nation gifts this to you." So I went up to Deerwood Rice and Grain up by Brainerd, Minnesota, and I found where they heat up and hull the wild rice. I said, "Do you have any wild rice hulls?" He said, "How many semi-loads do you want?" So I have my old van, and so I'm saying, okay, I'm going to get I'll just fill up my van. And it turns out that wild rice hulls don't melt to 2,380 degrees Fahrenheit. They're a natural refractory. So just think of it. We've had these wonderful biology, we had Dana giving us a sense of understanding a little bit about biomimicry. Okay, that shell to make wild rice doesn't pop off until 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's why you have to heat it. You have these big tumblers and drums of the Native Americans. Wild rice was as important to them as the sacrament on the Christian altar is to Christianity, because wild rice was a spiritual food. So the wild rice hulls need 500 degrees to pop off. A research biologist at the University of Minnesota told me that not only did the wild rice hull have these tremendous properties, but it's got the correct DNA information into it, that it can lie dormant at the bottom of a lake bed and sit there until the optimum conditions for water hydrology. So if it's a drought in Minnesota, that shell doesn't pop off and allow that seed to die for lack of water, that next generation seed. If it's a flood and the water is too high for that shell to pop off and go up for photosynthesis, it's not going to pop off. It knows the optimum conditions for the optimum environment. Where have we heard this before? And so we always pay respect to our teacher. That's why it's so delightful to see so many people here who have been deeply influenced by Buckminster Fuller, because this was my teacher. We got Sister Johanna. She lit every firing up until she passed away. So she's down here holding the ceremonial flame. There are about 400 people who come to the lighting at each firing. There'll be, we're firing teams. So for the scientists who are in the audience, we're stoking wood in 5.5-inch channel, 5.25-inch channels, right in among the pottery and in the Tanagashima chamber, and building up charcoal membranes so that when the atmosphere is passing through those charcoal membranes at 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, it's like you turning the radio wave dial on a transistor radio, the old radio waves, because each wave as it passes through a carbon membrane of 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit is changing its atmospheric environment. from oxidation spectrum to a reduction spectrum, and the whole rainbow of color in between that. All right? So this is the firing process. We're stoking wood right in among the pottery. There's the stoking windows, and then we're going over the top of the arch of the kiln at the end of the firing, sealing it with water and clay to keep oxygen from going in. These are the people that make my work. It takes 45 people, 8 people on 6-hour shifts. These are engineers, architects, poets, writers, aeronautical engineers, all different people of all different walks of life. When they put on a welding glove and they stick their hand into 2,300 degree heat, there's a little bell that goes off in our human experience. The DNA sounds something. And so cooks, and we have 9 cooks who help with the firing. These are the people who make this work. Okay, not me. So all these color palettes are coming from the natural flame. This is not a glaze. This is the atmosphere of oxygen and reduction and patterns of narrative going through the pieces and creating these kind of long, elongated color palettes on the surface. For designers, we've been given patterns that not necessarily have an understanding of its history. So how many have broken your grandmother's teapot handle, the mug with the handle, the pitcher with the handle? Handles were from a metal culture translating into a ceramic culture. When the British found tea and silk and porcelains and the Dutch East India trading on the other side of the planet and brought them over to Europe, they brought these type, this is a Korean, this is a Chinese one, they brought these handle things that became our new teapots as a design system. Well, they never used them for teapots. These are ceremonial wines. So if you go wine pouring vessels, you actually held onto them with a piece of brocade, never touching the handle, and you poured your wine ceremoniously. Okay? So then how was I going to then take that concept of green tea drinking into a modern system? Like an architectural programming, how do we get these apothecary fluids into the Homo sapien again without problems, without chemicals? So I met Paul Kruger, who's a knotting artist, and he had lost his leg in Vietnam. And his mother sent him a macrame kit. Remember those things that were hanging on the walls in the 60s with the mirrors and stuff like that? Pretty great thing. And then he realized that in a Scientific American article, while he's learning how to walk on prosthesis, that the knotting form is the bridge between abstract algebra and three-dimensional geometry. And that he was making single-strand knots. And when I met Paul, he was doing these phenomenal models of Buckminster Fuller, and he was inventing vector knots that would encode and sending the designs to the Buckminster Fuller Institute. So I had found my genius, that I could then have someone make a handle for me that would be non-breakable, generational, out of indigenous materials, using rattan and flaxland and whippings. And so the design of this is set up so Fuller said the sphere was the strongest. So if you drop the lid, you're going to break it less likely than having and then there's a screen on the inside so you can take your leaf tea. So every aspect of design was thought about and say, how do I get this teapot to be handed down generationally and we don't break it? That was the design challenge, excuse me. So then we started doing these various kinds of sculptural plates for service of food, and then Paul would make these beautiful single-strand knot handles of knots, and then he would hand dye and hand lacquer them in multiple layers. Stunning works of art. So that type of collaboration is incredibly important, very incredibly important. And then we ask our young people in the audience to kind of stretch their little brain cells for just a little bit this morning. 1997, after the first firing of the Johanna Kiln and exhibitions, a young man came in my studio at Christmas time, real tall, long hair, and he said, my mom and dad just sent me 2 cups for Christmas, and I need to talk to you. So come on in. So we're pouring tea, we're having tea, and he says, can I see your kiln and all of your data on how you fire your kiln and put water inside the kiln for hydrogen, oxygen breakdowns for clouds going through the atmosphere and all these types of things. So I get all this type of material out. We're talking for 3 hours, and then he says, "You're doing the same thing I'm doing." So I said, "Oh, great, you're a potter from Austin, Texas." He says, "No, I'm an astrophysicist, and my PhD research is in the Orion Nebulas." And this is one thing, if you take any notes today, this is the man you want to check out. His name is Luke Keller, K-E-L-L-E-R, Luke Keller, and he's part of the SOFIA project. So he says this to me, he says, "You're doing the same thing I'm doing. I'm an astrophysicist and you're a potter." So this just goes right over me. Okay, all right, fine. He says, "No, I'm going to send you all my NASA slides. I'm going to send you all this data of why what's going on in your kiln is so critically important from my study and my work." So he was at Cornell designing the new infrared telescope that is on this 747 at Andrews Air Force Base, that a 12 by 12 foot garage door opens, and this broad spectrum telescope. Now, Luke emailed me in July, and with that particular telescope, they just saw the surface of Jupiter for the first time. They're able to see through the clouds of Jupiter and into the surface of Jupiter to see what its surface looks like for the first time in humanity. He says, "So what you're doing is the same thing that I'm doing." So he sent me this data. All of our molecular structure on planet Earth is 10 to the power of 19 at 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. We're at 10 to the power of 19.17. He must have figured that out. I'm just sheerly going on the data, because I have no way of figuring that out. And so these hydrogen-oxygen clouds that are making new star formations are what are making this ceramic. So when I'm opening up that kiln at 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit and seeing a flow of information and energy flowing around matter, then I'm realizing that this tracking pattern and these designs are made by these hydrogen-oxygen clouds going through the system. That is the necessary reason why STEAM is so critical. So Luke, after he finishes working on the SOFIA project, is getting a solarizing lens. He's bringing it to the firing at St. John's so he can track hydrogen-oxygen clouds, do a mathematical algorithm to do a three-dimensional system of how star formations are formed in a 3D concept. Okay? So in those types of questioning, those types of ideas, probably the most important thing for us, or for myself, is that when we're looking at ourselves as artists, we are always thinking about how we are going to send messages forward. How, Don, your information is going to get forward to another person. How we're going to be able to make and impress upon the human family that as artists, we want those messages carried forward, just like Buckminster's Dream World. And so we go back to this artist from the 12th century. This is the Moss Temple Garden in Kyoto, Japan, the Kokedera, or Saihoji. And in order to go into this temple garden, because it was designed in the 12th and 13th century, we had to go to the temple and copy sutra prayers for a half an hour in calligraphy so that those prayers could be taken and put inside the pagoda. Then we were allowed into the garden. So I come up to the garden, I see this one area where there's this flotilla of stones. Beautiful little flotilla of stones in the middle of the garden. And I'm standing there with my mouth open. I'm going, "Oh my God, this is so stunning." And the abbot of Saihoji walks up to me and he says, "Do you know why these stones are here?" I said, I have no idea why these stones are here. And he says, when monks came from China, they brought the 7 medicinal healing plants for the health of the Japanese. So these, on each one of these stones, are the 7 healing plants that are coming across to heal. So as you're walking through the garden, then you see this. And I really want you to try and make this out. This right here. This little part right here is a sunken boat. And coming to Providence, or in Minnesota where we have 10,000 lakes, I looked at this and said, why would someone in this stunningly beautiful moss temple garden with 300 different varieties of mosses, it's absolutely a beautiful place, leave a sunken boat inside a garden? And coming to Minnesota or Providence, a sunken boat, someone just didn't take care of their boat. They just left it there for the winter. It got holes in it, barnacles ate it, we just left it there. But why would they put into a beautiful garden a sunken boat? And that's that artist trying to communicate to us 800 years forward that when you are in paradise, you no longer have to wander. You can let your boat be at rest. Thank you.